I wanted to say something about the animal nature of modular synthesizers. Um, I think there's a great benefit in associating or projecting uh, sentient qualities onto these machines. Yes, I know they're made of electrical components and they're designed by someone and pieced together by someone. Um, but they're often pieced together in ways that give them the appearance of agency. And I would argue that when you start interacting with them, they do take on agency. You end up in a kind of feedback process with them. I talked about, in one of the previous transmissions, I talked about that you're always in duet. And maybe I'd like to unpack that a little bit. What does that mean? That means this is a collaboration, that these instruments are more than instruments that obey my will as a player. It's more about a kind of compositional and improvisational collaboration, which can take some time to become meaningful. There's a lot of, I just got this particularly amazing synthesizer and here's my first thing with it. Here's my first performance with it for you online. And often these, you really hear the chaotic nature of the instrument more than the player, because the player hasn't really come to terms with the instrument yet. And I think over time, like if you have something like a sample and hold and or whatever it is, depending how you're controlling it, that can be really fascinating for a few hours, for a few days, for a few weeks, probably not for a few years. So then you think about what you want to get out of it, or your collaboration with it, and what that means. And one thing when I was giving presentations at different places, one thing I would say that a modular synthesizer is like a bag of cats or a bag of monkeys. You can influence it, but you can't really train and control it. And there should be limits to the amount, at least the way I think about it, there should be limits to the amount that you want to control it. Like if I really want to have this absolute linear, absolute obedience from a piece of machinery, then to my mind there's other machines that do it better. And part of the pleasure of these machines is that the non-linearities, more noisy, more chaotic possibilities. So, but that doesn't mean the machine has to take over. What it does mean, and what I really like about it, is that it turns me not only into a collaborator, but it turns me into a listener. And this is really the kind of relationship that I want to have with these machines. I want to be, I want it to put me in a listening state. And for me, that's also a state for performing music, a state for composing music, a state for crafting something, a particular kind of focus on audio phenomena. I find these machines can help with that. But it takes an interactive approach. It takes a respectful approach. So, and some machines are definitely better at that than others. Other machines are more either limited in what they do, or what they do is in a way preset. And this isn't anything to do with digital or analog or actual presets. It's more to do with the structure of the machine, like what it's designed to do. And the more open a structure, such as Surge, or in the software world, Max MSP, I often think of Surge and Max MSP as very closely related, both in the era that they emerged, but the ways of thinking behind it. They are low-level designs where you can get in at low functional levels, and you can make a lot of different interactions. Something like the Hordijk or the Weird or the Bucklers are higher level. They're giving you chunks of matter. They're giving you chunks of functions, chunks of functionality that are presented together in a way that it's suggesting how these things might be used. A more I don't want to say closed approach, because I don't think that's it, but it's a more instrumental approach in a way. It's delivering something that feels more like an instrument. What I love about the Surge is that it's trying to become an instrument. It needs the player to become an instrument. It's not really a clear proposition what it is, which is fantastic. I think this Hordijk also contains a massive amount of that kind of thinking, but it's a little bit disguised. I mean, when you look at it, also it looks like a Moog. Like, it's got this oscillator, dual envelope, 24 dB filter, a synced oscillator, a Wrangler, chaotic generator, Twin Peak, which is another filter, a matrix, which is a matrix. Be familiar if you've used EMS Synthy, same kind of idea. A triple LFO, a dual fader, which is basically a bunch of VCAs that can be crossfader or panner. A VCA shaper, which is a wave shaper with a VCA, a phaser, and a dual frequency shifter. So all of these are quite intelligible. I mean, if you know about synthesis, they're intelligible functional units, modules, as we call them. But once you get in there, it's perhaps it's not quite as open as a Surge, but in terms of the range of each aspect and the precision of the components means it's actually a much wider sonic universe inside this machine than in the Surge, I would say. You can just go much further and be much more precise. And that's not to insult Surge. This design comes decades after the Surge, and is extremely high quality components. And of course, modern synthesizer designers are building on the genius of people like Surge and Buchler and Harold Bode and all these people. So yes, it looks like a synthesizer. The functions are those familiar of a synthesizer, but in reality you can use it more like a laboratory device. Like, you can start with very little or with nothing, and that's one reason I appreciate it so much. It brings me to this state of beginner's mind, of approaching a synthesizer as if for the first time, responding to the sounds that I hear, and building, I mean, firstly a patch from that, but hopefully ultimately building a performance or a composition from that. But it's important for me, in the way that I regard composition, which is definitely related to Pierre Schaeffer, but also related to some of his followers, or some of his students, and it is also very much related to where I come from, which is like, actually, you know, punk rock, post-punk, Cabaret Voltaire, although somebody like Beatriz Ferreyra is extremely educated, intellectual, from an intellectual background. Compositionally, she's very choosing to be very naive that it's about this sound and it's about what you can do with this sound, and it's not about ideas. So the composition I make tonight might be almost unfamiliar to me when I listen to it tomorrow, because it's a new piece of work, and it comes from the experience of working with the sounds. Like, she works with tape recorders a lot still now, which is amazing to have stayed with that technique. But I'd contrast her with someone like what Cabaret Voltaire, Stephen Malander, and my mind's gone blank. You know the other two, Richard H. Kirk, and I'm actually going to stay with this till I remember. Chris, I can't believe I've forgotten this halfway through making a video. Shocking. I can't remember Chris's surname. I met him as well. Amazing. Anyway, yeah, you know who I mean. But their music, especially what they were doing between 1978 and 81, was extremely untutored. Like, they were using a studio, I think, in really sophisticated ways, and I think their artistic ideas are sophisticated. I think a lot of their, especially early music, still really stands up, and it's a big part of my background. So I'm working with electroacoustic composition. I'm working with a lot of really amazing improvisers, kind of technically and artistically really advanced people. But for me, it doesn't come from being educated or having a PhD or being able to talk lucidly about artistic ideas. I'm kind of lucky that I can do that. But in terms of composition, none of that is there. I'm starting from nothing. I'm not necessarily starting from wanting something to happen. Occasionally I might have an idea and think, I'll patch that, I'll see what happens. Or I might have an idea for a piece. I think, what if I combine sampled voices and whatever. The reality is that I never finish those pieces. They're often starting points, and they might become something else, because I'm only really happy dealing with sound, dealing with sonic structures, and that's really where all my music making comes from. So a machine like this, so what I'm describing is, it's a bit punky, it's a bit Zen. Let's call it the Zen-punk approach to composition. Or it's not even to composition, it's a Zen-punk approach to patching, to approaching these instruments. So it's partly about there's a sense of virtuality. So this, you can patch it up. It's only ever making one sound, but that's just a moment. That's just a possibility. Even within one patch, you change a knob like a microscopic amount, and depending on what the patch is doing, especially if there's feedback and more chaotic generation going on, you're in a different world. The frequencies are different, the timbre is different, the rhythmic quality is different, perhaps the spatial qualities change, and it quickly goes beyond something you can imagine. So for me to try and bring my taste, what I know I like, what I know I want, to a machine like this is a terrible waste. I think there's other machines you could do that with. I think particularly about a computer. And perhaps when I've got a lot of recordings, or I've made some particular sounds with this thing that I want, then I can take a very controlled, much more compositional approach and kind of think about what goes where and what works best where and what balances. I can go into this more formal compositional approach if I want to. But in terms of generating the material, it's good to be dumb. And I'm not joking about that. It can be really useful to know nothing about synthesizers. I mean, those amongst you who've been playing with these things for a while might share this experience that I've had, that somebody comes into your studio, could be a kid, could be someone who doesn't know much or anything about modular synthesis, and start patching up a couple of things, or you patch up a couple of things and they start moving the knobs, and they immediately start working in a way that is interesting, like that you wouldn't do, because you know how this machine works. So I know how this machine works. I know that the frequency, the oscillators, for example, extremely sensitive. So I'm if I'm adjusting like this, and this machine has taught me this over the years. The smaller the movement, the better. It feels like each knob on this could be like a ship's steering wheel, because often you just want to do it so small, and it's physically hard to do that, to make the moves as small as I want them to be. But someone else can come in and go chung, and they move the whole patch that I've got maybe by 10 octaves, and then the whole thing becomes something else. The feedback works differently. It might completely transform what's happening. And this kind of naivety of, well, what if I do that, is absolutely crucial. And the idea of being a virtuoso on an instrument like this, where you only do things that you know are going to work, or you really focus your activities on things that are going to produce a desirable response, is a terrible waste. And I'm not saying it's not good to learn that. Of course, the more you know about all these machines, the longer you spend on them, the better. But if you can combine that real knowledge or virtuosic ability with the instrument, with a mind that is, here's an object, I don't know what it does, all my training, all my previous experience of music does not tell me what I'm supposed to do with this instrument, or does not tell me what might be an interesting sound to hear now. Because that's a very different approach to patching. A more rational, that's not really the word, but maybe I'll stay with it. A more rational approach to patching would go, I want to achieve this, and therefore I know this much about envelopes, filters, VCAs, sequencers, to create that effect. This is how I go about patching that sound. People go, how do you patch a string sound, or how do you patch a Moog bass sound? And you're relying on your previous hearing of those sounds and your previous technical knowledge of the instrument to make that patch. The more you can develop that, the better, no question. I'm not putting anyone down for being great at sound design, but my approach is to be more, I don't know what's appropriate right now. I might have an idea, but I have to take account of the fact that my idea might be wrong. And I've played I made enough music to know, like listening back to recordings of concerts, especially when I was younger, thinking, that thing that seemed great at the time, objectively, when I listen back to it as an object, as a sort of a sound object rather than something I'm involved with in real time, you say, well, that wasn't so good. And I think that's one way that people learn to play, like jazz musicians and improvisers and noise musicians and or any musicians. You listen back to recordings of yourself. We have that facility now for the last 100 years or so. And you hear what you like, you hear what you don't like, and you refine your playing towards what you like. Great. Of course, it makes complete sense to do that. It's also really, really boring because you end up making music that you think you like. And that closes a lot of doors for music that might be much more interesting, that might be much more important, that might be much more creative. And people do this with modular synthesizers, with saxophones. They do it with all instruments. They narrow their ideas to what they think will create a desirable result. I mean, the other side to this, which I don't want to go into, is that if you know what you're trying to do, then why do it? I mean, that's the extreme side of that. That if you know that your favorite music is Lead Belly, American folk blues musician from the 1930s, then there's, I mean, you can spend your life trying to replicate that, but why? Firstly, you're not going to be able to, in the same way you're not going to be able to replicate Charlie Parker or Albert Ayler or Tito Puente, Duke Ellington. You're going to try and take that on, really? Like, it's done, and listen to it, learn from it, but it has no relationship with now. In my opinion, to play that music has no relationship with now. But when you do play that music, you know it's going to work, you know you did it well or did it badly. It's a much clearer proposition. You know, I'm covering a Joni Mitchell song. It sounds good, it sounds like the original, or it's different from the original. You've got some strong markers. For me, the point of coming into a studio like this is to leave all of that at the door. And it's not about being arrogant or being a genius or any of those things. It's about breathing some fresh air, and breathing some fresh air with our ears as well. And it's about admitting that, at least for me, that I don't know, or I don't always know, because sounds are surprising and music's surprising. So I'm going to finish here, but I'm always trying to explain why I've ended up with the instruments that I have. And I've said before, each instrument that I've kept, I think about as a life's work or a life's commitment. And there's a lot to be discovered. So the more knowledge you have, great. The more you leave that at the door when you go to create something, I believe the more interesting it is for everyone. So yeah, that's what this room's about for me. That's what this studio's about. That's what making music is about. Thank you. That was like a sermon on the Mount or whatever. And I'm not sure what I thought I was going to talk about at the beginning. I think I was going to talk about duets. Actually, I was going to talk about animals, the animal nature, which I didn't really do. But there you go. That's how these things go, isn't it?